A search for answers in Britain after 39 bodies are discovered in a truck. Can tragedies like this be avoided? And why have governments failed to stop the lucrative people smuggling trade? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. The latest deaths of undocumented migrants in Britain is highlighting the international struggle to combat people smuggling. Police in the UK are investigating how 39 people from China died in the back of a truck. It's believed they were taken through Bulgaria and Belgium. Rights groups warn such cases are likely to increase as European countries tighten their immigration rules. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this report by Cara Leck.
Security camera footage shows the truck driving past a storage facility in Essex in England after arriving from Belgium early on Wednesday morning. Less than an hour later, paramedics and police make a grim discovery inside: the bodies of 39 Chinese nationals.
This matter has attracted national and international interest, and it's absolutely imperative that the operation is conducted with the utmost respect for the 39 people who've lost their lives.
A 25-year-old driver has been arrested on suspicion of murder. It's believed he drove the front part of the truck from Northern Ireland to pick up the container, which is registered in Bulgaria to an Irish woman. Police have raided 3 properties in Northern Ireland they believe are linked to the case. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised to bring those responsible to justice.
This is an unimaginable tragedy and truly heartbreaking. I know that the thoughts and prayers of all members are with those who lost their lives and their loved ones.
Belgium's federal prosecutor has opened its own investigation after the container passed through the Belgian port of Zeebrugge. Britain has warned the country it could become a new frontier for people smuggling. Although scanners have been installed to detect people, officials at the harbour admit there's little they can do to stop them. The case echoes the deaths of 58 Chinese nationals who suffocated in a sealed container in Dover in 2000. Britain's National Crime Agency reported nearly 7,000 potential victims of human trafficking and modern slavery last year, up by 36% from 2017. Rights groups say people smuggling is becoming increasingly lucrative in Europe, and they warn what happened in Essex may not be the last. Cara Leck for Inside Story.
Let's take a closer look at the trade in human trafficking. Nearly 172 countries are part of a chain that exploits and enslaves more than 40 million people a year. For every 10,000 people in the world, nearly 54 are victims of modern slavery, with a quarter being children. And it's a big business for the traffickers. The World Economic Forum estimates it's worth $150 billion globally. Now over to our panel in Brussels. Joining us on Skype, Giulia, Lagana, an EU migration and asylum policy analyst at the Open Society European Policy Institute. In London, Lucia Bird, senior analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. In Belgrade, also on Skype, Jelena Hrnjak, a program manager at NGO ATINA, an organization working alongside the social protection system in Serbia to protect victims of human trafficking. Welcome to you all. Giulia, when you have 39 people found dead in a container, clearly there's something completely wrong with the checks here.
There's something completely wrong with the checks, that's for sure, but there's also something completely wrong with the system that produced the tragedy. And I mean, it's very heartening to hear that the Prime Minister of Great Britain has pledged to crack down on the people smugglers and traffickers responsible for those deaths, and has also sent his thoughts and prayers to the victims' families. But the problem here is, as you mentioned in the introduction, that it is getting increasingly dangerous for migrants, refugees, and other displaced people to reach Europe. And despite the fact that these people are needed in large part by the economy of Europe, there are very few legal ways for them to reach the countries where their labor will then be used. And that is why a lot of people are seeking smugglers to who enter the European Union and other countries in Europe more broadly. So I think the problem isn't just checks on the various routes, but that the routes are becoming increasingly dangerous precisely because of those increased checks. I mean, the reason we're now seeing Zeebrugge emerging as a trend in the migration routes from the mainland of Europe to Great Britain is because of the crackdown in Calais and Dover. And I think we need to get real about the fact that people continue to come and find the ways and to be able to do so without suffering the fate of the 39 people who died.
Lucia, the fact that the trailer arrived via ferry from Belgium calls into question security procedures at ports.
I can only echo what Giulia said here, which is, yes, the security procedures clearly didn't detect this. However, given the volume of freight, containers and other vehicles crossing these borders, it is extremely difficult for them to identify every single each content of the cargo. And actually, we should be taking a more macro perspective and looking at why more and more people are being forced to take these routes. And it is because, as already noted, safe and legal routes are shrinking.
Jelena, you've been working to protect victims of human trafficking. From your own perspective, what do you think went wrong here?
The first thing that is wrong is that we are speaking about the issue when the things happen, like the thing that happened, that people died. It's wrong to just think about it when, like bad things already happen. As you know, this is not the first time in European Union. We had several of cases, the similar cases with also huge numbers of people that either suffocate or died during the attempt to cross the border. Certain things should be done. First of all, the interests of smugglers and particular state governments shouldn't be the same. Like it seems like all the governments want just to see migrants out of the country, and not so many of them are having some actions to actually stop the smuggling, in the sense also to change their policies and to make life easier for people. As you know, we testified a huge migrant crisis that began in 2015. And we testified the closure of Balkan routes, but still people are coming and people are finding the ways how to cross the border and how to get to the EU.
Giulia, here is what is baffling to me, at least. I mean, this is happening in Europe, not in sub-Saharan Africa. And then you would assume that when a trailer is loaded into a boat, policemen or custom officers should be pretty much involved to ensure what is happening inside that trailer, instead of just ensuring whether there is a seal in the back of the trailer.
Sure. But as the colleague from the Transnational Institute for Organised Crime mentioned, I mean, it's impossible for border guards to control every single piece of freight moving across the European Union. I mean, we're talking, tens of millions every day. So what we should have is a system in place which ensures that if there is a demand for migrant labour in certain sectors of the economy in certain countries, there is a means and a way for these people to come legally. And we don't have that in the vast majority of European countries. The problem with just focusing on the law enforcement angle is it reinforces a series of problems with the system. Primarily, it victimizes the migrants, and migrants actually have their own will, and they decide to move, and they meet demand because they seek a better life or better opportunity. And then it also, generally, the crackdown hits the lowest rings in the chain, but not the kingpin running the smuggling networks. And then finally, it often leads to, gross judicial malpractice. In Italy, it's quite routine for prosecutors to arrest the so-called traffickers on board migrant boats. But normally they're not actually traffickers. They're actually the migrant who at that moment when they were rescued happened to be holding the tiller. So there's a whole series of problems with that approach. And that's why I said we need a broader model which encourages and enables migration for migrants, but also for refugees.
I see your point. Lucia, we're putting some emphasis here on the checks for the reason that people are saying, for example, that if the clampdown at the Calais, Dover is working, why aren't those procedures replicated elsewhere, at least to ensure that we protect the victims, the migrants?
Well, to date, the focus of European approaches here has been on border control. And that isn't working because it doesn't stop movements, it just displaces it, as we are seeing here. And routes will continue to fragment, to move away from routes that have been closed off. And actually, it increases the protection risks for the migrants and the refugees. And we see more and more tragedies like this. So, of course, calls for greater border checks are understandable, but those calls have been repeated for years and years, and they are not working. We need a different approach.
Jelena, your country has been described as a source, transit and destination country for children and women trafficked for sexual and labor exploitation. Do you think that we've focused for many years on migrants and we suddenly forgot that the root issue here is the need to figure out how to deal with organized crime gangs?
Yes, I think that the focus of the authorities should be the perpetrators at the first, and then they should take care of the migrants. Also, I have to emphasize the part of voluntarism when it comes to the smuggling. I really have to emphasize that, because when you're speaking with migrants, they would say to you, yes, I gave my consent to, I don't know, go to that place or that place, but nobody gave the consent, to end up in like some lorry or to die in such a tragic way. So we have to make a really clear distinctions between on what migrants are giving the consent and what not. Also, when we are interviewing them, they say that they were coerced by smugglers to do certain things. So coercion to commit criminal activities is a human trafficking for itself. So this is something that we really need to be careful about when we are discussing this issue.
I see your point.
And when people are in a really hard position, it's really easy actually to coerce them to commit criminal activities.
I absolutely see your point. That consent itself is something which is abused by the criminals because they take advantage of the desperate situation of those migrants.
There are many. Yeah, there are, for example, many minors, like underage children that cannot be legally responsible for that. And, smugglers, they know that and they use their difficult position. So we can't say that the children are those that did something. They were coerced to do certain criminal activities. So this, I think, has to be really clear when it comes to the issues of explaining what is going on the ground. And regarding your questions, yes, Serbia is a country also of transit and a country of source and destination for some of the victims. Like predominantly Serbian citizens are the ones who are exploited. Half of them are exploited mostly in EU countries and half of them in here in Serbia. Mostly they are children, mostly they are women. They're also trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation, for the purpose of labor exploitation. Also, our system encountered several cases of girls being forced to marry in some of the EU countries. Also, we encountered several of coercions, either to beg, either to commit some criminal activity.
So we're talking about a thriving criminal activity. Giulia, is this inevitable even when you have robust checks at the borders, countries erecting more fences, and all this anti-migrant sentiment which has been exploited by populists in the European continent?
I think it's inevitable as a consequence precisely of those actions and that rhetoric. The European Union for the last 3 or 4 years has made its mission, closing the borders to irregular migrants and combating people smuggling and trafficking. But the end result has been, as you pointed out, more fences and borders and, the outsourcing of migration controls to the likes of Libyan militias. who were previously smugglers but are now interceptors instead of to stop the migrants from arriving in Europe. So I think what we really need to focus on, I think that's being echoed by a lot of people on this panel, is something completely different, which is, of course, we need border controls and we need safe borders for everyone, including the people crossing them to seek protection. But we also need to look at the demand for that abuse and that exploitation. What is creating that demand and how we can address the system so that demand is eliminated. It's not enough to crack down on the gang masters in the field. You have to really look at why farmers are having to seek recourse to exploited, undeclared, undocumented migrants. Because the system is structured the way it is. The agricultural system in Europe does not foresee the kind of protections and labor standards that it should.
Lucia, you said earlier that there needs to be a new approach, but then when you talk to governments in Europe about the need to clamp down on human trafficking and people smuggling, they would talk about all the logistical difficulties, language barriers, political dynamics in different parts of the world, the corruption that is prevailing in many parts of the world, as obstacles that prevent a comprehensive, united, coordinated approach to deal with this issue.
So I think there are 2 points here. Firstly, I'd like to take the opportunity to distinguish between human smuggling and human trafficking, because I think it's very important that we recognise that these are 2 distinct crimes under international law, although they are far too often elided. So with human smuggling, there is consent for the movement, although, as noted before, there may not be consent for the abuse that comes afterwards. The movement is cross-border, and the intent of the smuggler is material or financial gain. With trafficking, you either don't have any consent or the consent is rendered irrelevant because of coercion or deception. There doesn't have to be cross-border movement. A lot of trafficking happens within one country. And the intent of the perpetrator is exploitation, so forced labour or sexual exploitation in general. And it's very important to distinguish between them because at the heart of human smuggling is the desire of people to move. And if there are no legal and safe avenues for movement, and states are making this more and more difficult, you are growing the market for the services that smugglers provide. Then separately, we have trafficking. And in the context of trafficking, states are right. There are lots of obstacles here to proper investigation. But I think one thing that we need to emphasize, particularly in the context of forced labor, is the role of the private sector. Previously, this has been a government-led response. The government has been the one that's supposed to monitor employment laws, and a lack of capacity to do so means that it's de facto been unmonitored. More recently, we've recognised that there is a significant role for the private sector to play in monitoring their own supply chains. And we're seeing a growth in the legal obligations that are placed on the private sector. So the UK in 2015 brought out the Modern Slavery Act, which was groundbreaking, together with the Californian Act that only slightly preceded it, in requiring the private sector look at its own supply chains and start to monitor this. So yes, there are problems, the government can do more, but actually this is not going to end well without the help of the private sector. The good thing is that the private sector are being compelled to take a more active role, and we are seeing more initiatives from the private sector in fighting trafficking.
You're talking about the need for the private sector to step in. Jelena, you work in the NGO, and you see that investigators now in the UK are trying to combine the dots because they're talking about the trailer originating in Bulgaria, then shipped all the way to Belgium before its final destination. So we're talking about the potential for this to be pretty much well coordinated by criminal activity. From your own perspective, from your own experience, what do you think that should be done immediately now to raise international awareness about the need to stop and end those tragedies?
Yeah, there has to be a clear cooperation between the governments. It's not easy. In this case, all of the states, they are like still EU countries. It's been a difficulty for Serbia because we are still in pre-accession phase. Also, to also talk with to exchange more information between the governments and the police who are in separate countries, because then they will have more time. If they are following up certain cases, maybe they they can't they can't recognize them while being in Bulgaria, but then they have time until they reach some other destination country. Usually what we see is that these processes are repeating. So when you are looking at Interpol reports or Eurostat report, you can see that there are certain organized group that are dealing with this kind of issues. So for sure, to have more exchange between the countries of what they are noticing on the borders and other.
Giulia, when we're talking about the desperate journey for those people, particularly when it comes to people smuggling to reach Europe, you know that European countries have been scrambling to put together or to agree on migration reforms. That didn't happen, and the UK is planning to crash out of the EU. Don't you see the EU countries themselves responsible in a way or another for the tragedies that are happening?
In some way, yes, of course. I mean, as I mentioned before, the result of this harsh attempts to keep people out is inevitably tragedy. And we've seen that not just recently, yesterday, but all across the EU's external borders, in the Mediterranean, along the so-called Balkan route, in Croatia, for instance, on the border with Bosnia. There is systematic violence perpetrated against refugees and migrants trying to get into the EU. So in a way, this is, of course, a consequence of policy choices and also of policy non-choice. As you mentioned, yes, of course, the lack of agreement on reforming the system has paralyzed the system. So the sole response is crack down on people's movement. And as Lucia rightly pointed out, we really have to distinguish between smuggling and trafficking. They're two places, and people often move irregularly, but not exploitatively. To reach their destination, and they then get exploited when they reach their destination because there are not the proper conditions in place.
Let me go to Lucia. Lucia, I see your point when you talk about the need to involve new actors in the global fight against organized crime. But then ultimately we're talking about a massive international crime industry that generates billions of dollars a year. So even the potential to raise international awareness, if it's not combined with a robust approach by many, many countries globally, we may not be able to defeat them.
Of course, and you're right, this is a very lucrative business, and some of the organised crime groups involved in human trafficking are extremely sophisticated and well organised and well able to evade law enforcement in many cases. So global cooperation is definitely required. However, we have to bear in mind that of all those that are trafficked globally, a really large proportion are in forced labour, and over 20 million of those are working in the context of the private sector. And the private sector has global supply chains. So, for example, a company incorporated in the UK might have supply chains that stretch across the developed and the developing world. And precisely because these groups are extremely sophisticated and have vast resources at their fingertips, it's not enough to suggest that law enforcement do more. The private sector also has to step up, and it has the power to do so because of the reach of its own supply chains. I'd also briefly like to comment upon your question earlier about whether it's EU state policies that are causing this, and just note that I found it very interesting that in the summer earlier this year, there was a case actually brought against the EU in the International Criminal Court for some of the fatalities on the Mediterranean crossing. So it is clear that many are holding the EU and individual member states accountable.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Lucia Bird, Giulia, Lagana, Jelena Hrnjak, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.